Hello, hello, hello. You're listening to CorpusCast with me, Dr. Robbie Love. This is the podcast from Aston University about corpus linguistics and what it can do for society. Welcome once again. Today, we're dialing back the clock to better times and wrapping ourselves in the warm, fuzzy blanket of nostalgia. Specifically, how corpus linguistics is helping researchers to better understand the role of nostalgia in contexts like public discourse, not just because it feels nice to take a gentle stroll down memory lane, but potentially it's a powerful persuasive technique. So to take me on a sepia-toned sentimental journey through the language of nostalgia, I'm lucky to be joined by not one, but two guests today, both of whom I've been hoping to have on the show for quite some time, so I'm very glad that we finally made it happen. My first guest is Charlotte Taylor, Professor of Discourse and Persuasion in the Department of English Language and Linguistics at the University of Sussex. Charlotte's research interests are in the analysis of language as used for evaluative and persuasive purposes, and she's worked extensively in the context of political and media discourse, with interests ranging from impoliteness, migration discourses, science communication in the press, metaphor, and methods in corpus and discourse analysis. And her books include Patterns and Meaning in Discourse and The Language of Persuasion in Politics. And she has a long-running collaboration with our other guest today, leading to publications including their co-edited book, Corpus Approaches to Discourse, A Critical Review. Not much more of a hint that you need if you're familiar with that particular book. I'm also joined by Anna Marchi, Senior Assistant Professor in the Department of Interpreting and Translation at the University of Bologna. Anna's research interests include corpus linguistics, discourse analysis, research methods, news and political discourse, and journalism studies. And in 2019, Anna published the book Self-Reflexive Journalism, a corpus study of journalistic culture and community in The Guardian. Anna is editor-in-chief of the Journal of Corpus and Discourse Studies, of which Charlotte is also an editor. Aside from all of that, none of which we're really going to talk about, actually, today our focus is on Charlotte and Anna's most recent work on the topic of nostalgia, specifically their project Media Narratives of Nostalgia, an investigation of emotions, storytelling, and newsworthiness using corpus. So, without further ado, please welcome our guests to the show, Charlotte Taylor and Anna Marchi. Hello, both, and welcome to CorpusCast.
Hi, Robbie. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much. It's great to see you both. As I said, I've been hoping to have you on for some time, and I'm so glad that we found a time to make this recording. So thanks again. We're going to dive in, of course, with the question I always ask my guests to kick things off. And Charlotte, I'll put you in the hot seat first to ask, what does corpus linguistics mean to you?
It's a great question, because I think we're quite good at being reflexive in corpus linguistics, but we don't often stop and think about exactly what it is that we're doing, maybe. So I think probably someone who, when I hear, assertions made and claims made, the first question I tend to think is, how do we know that? And so I suppose at the most basic level, corpus linguistics is just a way of being able to answer that question of, how do we know that? So this week I was asked something that's much more your area of expertise, Robbie, which was, has swearing increased? And, the obvious way of addressing that would be, well, let's go and have a look at some data and then see whether it's increased or not. So I think that's kind of the first thing of what corpus linguistics means. But I'd hope it's also a way of seeing something different, rather than just more of the same. And I was really struck by something Susan Hunston said in one of her plenaries, which was that corpus linguistics software rearranges the data so you can see the patterns that are latent within it. So it's just sort of restructuring how we look at it to see something different.
And sticking with you, Charlotte, for now, this is something that I always find fascinating, people's journeys into doing research in corpus linguistics. Give me a bit of your own sort of academic background and specifically, at what point did you come to realize that this is something that you were interested in pursuing as your research career?
Yeah, it's a very circuitous route, I would say. So my undergraduate degree was literature. So, I was interested in language, but from a very different perspective. And then, like quite a lot of people probably, I thought I'd have a year out when I graduated before I went on to do a master's. So I did the CELTA to train to teach English, and then I went and taught English. And I was expecting to do it for a year. It was just a way of, being in Italy and working there. And then, of course, once you start teaching and then your students start asking these brilliant and very difficult questions, then you realise that language is so much more interesting and complex than maybe you were first thinking. So, yeah, I think that was kind of my entry point into really thinking about language, not in terms of, looking at literature, but just language itself. And, also realising that we didn't know the answer to so many questions that I was being asked. I think that was really great.
And at what point did you first encounter specifically corpus linguistics? Who was it? Who and where and in what context were you introduced to that?
Yeah, well, this is probably the same part as Anna's in that it was Professor John Morley at the University of Siena. So I was working then as an English language lecturer. And he said to me one summer, would I like to work on a project looking at courtroom discourse? And it was basically preparing a corpus. And then, yeah, it was really fascinating. That's when I got into impoliteness and aggression, obviously looking at the courtroom discourse. But yeah, getting familiar with the tools of corpus linguistics and realising that actually it could start to answer lots of the questions that students had when I'd been teaching as well. So yeah, it was really that Siena base that got me into corpus linguistics.
And of course, you're now at the University of Sussex. How long have you been based at Sussex?
About 10 years now, which surprises me every time I say it. It still feels like a couple of years, but yeah.
And you've done your PhD at Lancaster as well, right?
Yes. Yeah, so I did my PhD part-time and distance, which was a shame because I would have loved to be at Lancaster more. It's such a brilliant place to be. But it was a really great place for me. So I was combining my interest in impoliteness and language aggression, working with Jonathan Culpeper and applying corpus linguistic tools to that. So yeah, it was a really great experience.
And Anna, of course, I'll turn to you. And we in fact, I think the three of us have that particular thing in common, at least of doing our PhDs at Lancaster, which is a theme that perhaps unsurprisingly has emerged with a few guests who either on the podcast who either work there or have worked there or studied there at one point. So I'll ask you the same question. I'm interested in your perspective and how closely aligned to Charlotte's thoughts on corpus linguistics you are as well. What does corpus linguistics mean to you?
Well, Robbie, I'm a big fan of your show. And this part that you ask is always my favorite because, that was such a great answer. And then I thought, what would my answer be? And I thought about it for a while, but only realized what it would be this morning. I thought the great thing really for me about corpus linguistics is surprise. So the fact that you can so often say, oh, I didn't know that. Well, I didn't expect that. And it sort of gives you a variety of, not just one different perspective, but a variety of different perspectives. So Charlotte often calls it looking from many windows. And I agree, it's very much that. So the great thing is that we're stuck with ourselves most of the time, actually all of the time. And corpus linguistics sort of gives you the chance to suspend your own point of view and unsettle habits. Just look at things from a perspective that you wouldn't or couldn't have, simply because that's not how our brain works, but that's how a computer would let you see things. So it's the idea of change and being given the chance to explore more than yourself. So multiplicity in a way that I like as an experience of corpus linguistics.
I'll ask you the same as well. I'm always curious about at what point you discovered linguistics and specifically corpus linguistics. So what was your journey into the sort of research that you do now?
Okay, I was supposed to be a journalist in the sense I've always wanted to be a journalist. And I studied journalism. I went to grad school to study journalism. And I met Charlotte in Siena while I was in media studies when John Morley was my supervisor for my thesis. And I've always also been a word nerd. So, but the two things kind of didn't meet until John offered me a job tagging corpora, so compiling and tagging corpora. So I did a little bit of research during my BA working on journalistic corpus, but then I went back to journalism and was determined to do that. And eventually coming back from the United States where I was, when I started grad school for journalism, and I had no job, and I was offered to do that. And it happened, and I was fascinated by it. But it's also when Charlotte and I started working together, that was like about 20 years ago, something like that. Sorry, but it is.
I want to ask you about that in a moment, but I just want to pick up on your introduction to corpus linguistics was being asked to do some tagging. Was that manual tagging or?
Yeah, it was actually transcribing television news. So it was BBC and CBS were transcribing and manually annotating for speakers' turns and things like that. So very careful manual tagging of news.
Wow. And that wasn't enough to put you off. I'm amazed.
No, I actually love that kind of thing. I still do when I'm nervous. That's best practice.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you've known each other for I'll sort of mouth it about 20 years now. And that was in Siena, right? That was how you first came to know each other?
Yeah.
And at what point did you, because you have, I mentioned a couple of your publications at the beginning, but you have collaborated on several projects now at this point over the years. At what point did your kind of research, how do I say it, partnership, I suppose, sort of you became regular collaborators. At what point did you realize, maybe there's something we can work together on? What was the beginning of that for you?
I think it probably just came out of talking about the projects we were working on. And I think we were both interested in those kinds of theoretical, methodological issues of what are we doing when we do this? And so that's when we did the paper together on a winter's night, where we were looking at, sort of triangulation and playing around with those sorts of things.
And
we've been consistent collocates ever since.
Oh, I love it. I said, I think there's a T-shirt in that or something. Maybe we should have branding for the next Corpus Linguistics conference or something. Yes, I may note that down. You give me an idea. We'll start to sort of move on to, I was about to say delve, but then you might think I'm reading off of a ChatGPT generated script. I'm going to avoid saying delve. Instead I'll say dive. We'll dive into the topic of nostalgia. And I want to start with I suppose the obvious question, because it's not something that I'd previously seen really discussed too explicitly, specifically in corpus linguistics research, too often, thinking about nostalgia from a linguistic perspective. But in general, what is your sort of working definition of what do we mean when we're actually talking about nostalgia?
Well, that's, I think, anything but obvious, in the sense it's most difficult thing to do is give a definition of anything, really, because it depends on what you want to do with it afterwards. Yeah. But nostalgia, I would say it's particularly difficult because Craig Evans, whom I'm working with on a corpus of desert island discs, says nostalgia, you feel like you have understood what it is, but then it's elusive. It slips away the minute you think you've understood what it is. And I think it's quite right. So in the paper Charlotte and I presented last time, Corpus Linguistics, we sort of looked at nostalgia, looking at the label nostalgia. So it's a bit getting to the definition of nostalgia depending on how it is discussed and how it is talked about or written about. And that would be one definition. But then there's, alongside nostalgia discourse, there would be nostalgic discourse. So we're describing what nostalgia does when we want to define it, or what nostalgia is as label. And I think we're trying to do a little bit both things, because one sort of is intricately intertwined with the other. So we say there's nostalgias rather than nostalgia. Most specifically, I think we can't get away from the distinction between more collective or historical nostalgia and personal nostalgia. And this because even in terms of the science behind it, there are two traditions. So there's people who have discussed about the negative aspect of nostalgia, this idea of manipulative or toxic nostalgia that sort of mythicize particular aspects of the past or imagined or real, and how dangerous that is, namely Brexit, Donald Trump, and populism in general, and all sorts of evils or reactionary politics that can happen. And then there's the psychological research that has been done on nostalgia, which is mainly about personal nostalgia, how nostalgia is good for you. But I think there is an overlap between this negative reputation and the good feeling that we understand nostalgia to be, because, well, it wouldn't be sellable if it didn't feel good. So there's sort of have to come together. So there's an interplay between the two. So when we define it in order to tackle it linguistically, we have to bear in mind that that distinction between, yes, the reflective and restorative, I think, would be the definition of Svetlana Boym, is the scholar who all nostalgists go back to.
So we're sort of talking about this idea of looking back at the past sort of wistfully, and it seems from what you're saying that there are actually various functions of nostalgia, both sort of cathartic or within an individual experiencing nostalgia, but then of course the performance of nostalgia, and we'll get onto that side of the linguistic aspects. But what do you think? Maybe part of your work is to try and answer this question, at least from a linguistic perspective. But in general, what purpose? Why does nostalgia exist? What are the sort of broad functions, and how do you sort of begin to sort of try and tackle this kind of in terms of the way people talk, both, as you said, people talking about nostalgia, but then people performing nostalgia through talking about their own experience of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really difficult to sort of say why do we have nostalgia, because that sort of goes beyond what we can reach through language analysis. But in terms of functions, I think it's much easier to identify those through the language analysis as well as the previous work. And I think exactly as Anna was saying, it really depends on which type of nostalgia we're talking about. So if you've got nostalgia in the sense of that kind of pang that you get when you smell something, and it just triggers this completely unprompted, very specific personal memory, is really different from that kind of commodified nostalgia that you get. So let's say you go to an event that's themed around a particular historical period, and you're really being heavily prompted to nostalgize about that moment as understood in that particular way. And then that, again, is quite different from the kind of nostalgia of the Make America Great Again, right? So I think these different forms of nostalgia have very different functions, and they vary according to that kind of individual versus social, political sort of function. But I mean, for me, one of the most interesting things about the function of nostalgia is that it has simultaneously two completely opposing functions if we're thinking of collective nostalgia. So on the one hand, there's a really substantial body of work, particularly from social psychology, showing how it has this very pro-social function. So if you get people to share a collective sense of nostalgia, essentially you're creating an imagined community. And then that community is likely to look after itself. So you get things like research that's been done on how establishing a sort of collective nostalgia increases empathy for people within that group who share that same nostalgic imagining. And therefore it'll increase charity contributions and things like this. So really sort of effective pro-social functions. But then at the same time, by creating these sort of collectives, what you're doing is also bordering, right? So at the same time as you have warmer sentiment towards people who are part of that collective group, you're likely to have some sort of antipathy or hostileness towards people who are outside that group. And then obviously in certain spheres that we'll probably talk about later, this gets leveraged very actively in order to create sort of more antisocial elements. And so to me, that sort of simultaneous pro-social, antisocial function, I think is really fascinating about it.
And this is really interesting because, Anna, you mentioned earlier the example of sort of populist rhetoric and potentially the quite persuasive power of what you're calling collective nostalgia, which I think intuitively is a really nice way of describing what we're talking about here. Is that specifically, is that the kind of context that, motivated you to start working together on nostalgia from a corpus perspective? Was it looking at, how are powerful people and entities, how did it, to what extent and how do they use collective nostalgia in their public communicate? Was that kind of the spark that maybe, there's something that we can do here, or were you always interested, in nostalgia sort of more broadly anyway? What sort of led you to decide we're going to work together and try to see what corpus linguistics can contribute to investigating this particular issue?
Well, it wasn't for me really. Charles came up with the idea of nostalgia, and I thought, that would be very difficult to study using corpus linguistics. And I like a challenge. So that was my main reason to get into nostalgia at all, was purely methodological. Then it's a fascinating topic. So it really grows on you because you start seeing it everywhere. So I don't know if it happens with anything you do, but certainly did with nostalgia. It's popping out from every corner. So, but initially for me, it was exclusively methodological, like how can we possibly do this using corpora? Because we know that it's one of those things that are difficult to count that we like to try to count,
Yeah, I'll ask you about that in a moment, because I sort of from the outside looking in at the issue of nostalgia, it sounds like something that would be quite tricky to investigate, and I do want to ask you about that. But I just want to pick up on something you said there, where suddenly you started noticing that you're seeing it everywhere around you. Tell me, either or both of you, please, tell me more about what you mean by that, in the sense of where do you see it, and how can you tell that it's nostalgia, in the sense that I'm assuming that this is largely implicit. I'm thinking about, maybe, I don't know, I'm assuming there's quite a lot of it in advertising, for instance, and marketing, right? Sort of getting people to look back on a previous segment, but they're not going to be telling you, I'm assuming, up front, this is our strategy and this is nostalgia. So how do you, start to sort of see it around you, and how pervasive do you think it is?
I mean, I could start with where I sort of got interested in nostalgia, which was really from working on migration discourses. And there it is very pervasive in all sorts of different ways. And I think, it's that thing, once you start seeing it, you start looking for it, I suppose, so you see it everywhere. But I mean, migration discourses, I didn't expect to end up looking at nostalgia when I was doing the project on migration discourses. And it really sort of came out of both things that were happening at the time. And, I was saying, I have this thing about somebody makes an assertion, I'm like, how do we know that? And it was sort of partly that around 2019, around the time of the Windrush scandal, if you remember that, it was when the government was surprised to learn, I think it's fair to say, that there was a lot of public outrage at the way their hostile environment policies had affected people who'd moved to the UK in the 40s, 50s, 60s, early 70s. And their defence was always, we've always welcomed these people. We didn't mean them. We were trying to get these other ones, right? And so, immediately you're like, really? Is that actually the case? And so when you've got the corpora, you can go back and look at the historical record and say, well, were these people welcomed at their point of arrival? And of course, the answer is no. They were described using exactly the same language that was used for the people who are described as illegalized immigrants today. And so that's sort of one of the things that comes up in migration discourses. So one is there's this sort of really powerful myth of we've always been a welcoming country. And because we've always been a welcoming country, we can be hostile now without a negative evaluation of us. It's just a very clever sort of rhetorical move. So you've got that element of nostalgia. But I think there's also this sort of broader myth of migration, which relies on nostalgia, which is that there is an us group who's intrinsically different from the out group of migrants, and the we group is static and homogeneous. And of course, you can only maintain that myth if you basically erase all past migration. And so you have this kind of nostalgia around there being this sort of constant stasis of the us group, and you get rid of everything else. So I think nostalgia is really powerful in migration discourses, and they're just sort of two examples of it. And that's how I started seeing it elsewhere.
That's really interesting. I mean, this is really sort of very much on the outside looking in, as I said, but from what you're saying, it sounds like nostalgia isn't just about getting people to look back to, in reality, how things used to be and real memories of what things actually were like, but also to encourage myth making in a way of an imagined past. Would you consider that all just nostalgia, or do we have kind of two different subtypes, I guess, of nostalgia? One which is remember when this thing that was actually real was happening, and wasn't it better, or whatever, or encouraging, as you said, sort of creating a fake or false nostalgia of a past that didn't actually exist, to persuade people to take on a certain position.
I mean, I think that's part of why nostalgia is so persuasive, right? Is that, it can be personal, but we know that memory is a very slippery thing, and the things we think we remember, we might not experience. But, I mean, people have nostalgia for their own past, but they have nostalgia for past that they never experienced. So, like people who are, I don't know, in their 20s, going along to a revival event celebrating the 40s. Yeah. So they have no personal experience of that, but they have this nostalgia for the time. And they have nostalgia for that. Sorry?
There's even a word for that.
Of course.
It's called anemoia. So it's nostalgia for things you've never experienced.
Yeah.
Oh, anemoia.
Yeah. And then there's, nostalgia for things that never existed.
Yeah.
Like this kind of mythical green land. A really good example, I think, is around language standards. That, every period of time has nostalgia for a time when language was better and it was done right. But if you go back and look at the language debates at that point in time, of course, they were saying, oh, no, it was that other time. And so, yeah, you absolutely have nostalgia for things that never existed or that you never experienced.
Yes, and by logical extension, if we carry on far enough back, we'll have people who'd only just started using language in the way we do, talking about, wasn't it great before language even existed? And we had to communicate in a way. It wasn't language that was better, it wasn't great before we even had it. Yeah, that is something that I find quite hilarious. You go back and you see, there's Twitter threads and some people saying, well, 200 years ago, people were complaining about the youth ruining language, and we're still here. So, yeah. Anna, I want to ask, where else, you said, you start seeing it sort of everywhere. Where else are the sort of places that you're observing this, or is it easier to ask where don't you find it, I suppose?
Well, for starters, an immense amount of books have been published only in the past couple of years on nostalgia. I mean, historians all of a sudden are focusing everything on nostalgia, and it's very much either a kind of rehabilitation of this negative view that has been the so-called traditional view in sociology or history or politics, where nostalgia is associated with unfactfulness and manipulation. But really what Charlotte was saying about the unfactfulness is both in the positive and in the negative views. Even neuroscientists who study nostalgia describe it as not autobiographical memory, but imagination. So it's more similar to imagination, really, than to actual memory. Other places I've seen it, music, revival. So this you go around and everything is a tribute concert to some. So, and it's probably it's probably happened before, because there's nothing new about that. It's very much the same. Now we claim to be in a specifically nostalgic age, but so they did about around the 1970s. It was the same. So there's always a nostalgic callback to nostalgic times themselves. So there's a bit of that.
This reminds me a bit of I studied about metaphor, but when I was an undergraduate, and from a linguistic perspective, and then sort of suddenly realized that almost all of language is metaphorical. So it's everywhere, and everything is in some way figurative, or will become figurative eventually. Is like, and then you sort of think it seems a similar sort of thing when as you said, Charlotte, when you start looking for something, you realize it's everywhere around you. I want to get into kind of some of the more.
Sorry, Rob, but this sort of makes a case for corpus linguistics in itself, because I know that it's not true that it's everywhere.
No.
It's just that I'm seeing it everywhere because I'm biased towards it.
Yeah,
So,
exactly. We need something, I sometimes hesitate to say objective, because that is quite a maybe controversial claim to make in terms of just how objective corpus linguistics is, but it certainly is more objective than just sitting there and deciding for yourself, I suppose, without looking at any evidence. So let's talk about the evidence, the data. What kind of data are you looking at sort of currently, or have you been looking at recently in your work together on nostalgia? Tell us a little bit about the corpus data that you're looking at, and then I will ask you, how on earth do you actually look in the data for nostalgia? But I suppose we should set the scene a bit by talking a bit about what data sets you have that you're looking for nostalgia in at the moment.
well, Charlotte and I worked together on diachronic corpora of newspapers and of Hansard-Su Parliament. And we looked at the label nostalgia and how it's been used, nostalgia and nostalgic, how they've been used diachronically from the 1950s up to today. And we used that data for, well, I suppose, two reasons. One is the main reason why we use any data in corpus linguistics, because it's available. There's a lot of it, and it's possible to do diachronic analysis. And since nostalgia is intrinsically about time, it seemed important to input the time into the question. So I did a little bit of more synchronic things before, but I think the diachronic element is very important, and also the fact that it's sort of two different aspects of public discourse, so media discourse and political discourse. And since the claim is that nostalgia has such a pervasive effect in terms of collective perception of reality, it seemed like a good place to look. Then we also
So the historical one, just to add, is I think the other thing is that because one of the really key things about nostalgia is that it's not about just looking back. It's about looking back to make a comment about the present or project something into the future, right? So what's really interesting about doing a diachronic study is you can look at, what are the things that we are supposed to be nostalgic about at different points in the past. And of course, those shift and they tell you something about the moment in which people are nostalgizing, because they're the things that are being picked up as being salient and missing from that moment.
Oh, so it's a window in a political context. It's a window through which, you can observe what leaders are telling people they should miss or should want.
Yeah. And what they're saying is missing from the present, but necessary for the present.
Yes,
right.
That's very interesting. So, in that context, you're looking for presumably you're searching for when people are actually saying the word nostalgia or nostalgic, right?
Yeah.
In order to find the kind of meta commentary in a way of talking about nostalgia, right?
Yeah, so it's kind of like the first stage of the project was we start with how does the concept get named and how is it used? And also, how is it used, for instance, in political debate to delegitimize other people's opinions? You're just being nostalgic. Your nostalgia is worthless and trivial and rose-tinted. Mine. It's
also there's a sort of negative evaluation of
the word
nostalgia
itself as a pervasively and enduringly negative prosodies. That is
at least in political.
Not as much as I would have thought initially. So I find it so pervasively negative, but not as intensively negative I would have thought compared to the literature about it.
That's really interesting because if you've got people, using it as a strategy themselves, but also saying, well, you're being nostalgic. That's an indulgence, or just not a great. That's interesting in and of itself. do you, and maybe you haven't moved on so much to this, but if we're looking for discourse that is observably nostalgic, but they're not labeling it explicitly as what I'm saying is nostalgia, right? It's implicit. That clearly gets us into a territory of, well, we're moving from a form to function analysis in a way, and presumably gets suddenly much, much trickier from a corpus perspective in terms of looking for and retrieving. So I suppose my question is, how do you do that? And have you found, or do you think, if not yet, do you think there may be some reliably retrievable linguistic cues where if there's a certain construction that you can search for from a formal perspective may be an indicator of something that's likely to be nostalgic, or are there any linguistic patterns associated with people being nostalgic as opposed to talking about nostalgia, right?
My answer would be yes, but.
Okay.
So we knew that there was something to be explored there because of the very essence of nostalgia being a word that you wouldn't want to use about yourself. At the same time, there's a pleasure in the being nostalgic itself. So how do people avoid? How can people be nostalgic or invite nostalgia in others without obviously doing so, and certainly without using the word? So my initial hunch was that there would be an overlap between the discourses surrounding the label nostalgia itself and nostalgic discourse. So, and I tried to explore that overlap, and we did more so in the diachronic study. And I think some key features emerged quite evidently. One, of course, being memory itself, because nostalgia is intrinsically bound to not so much real memory as much as the expression of reminiscence. And that wasn't enough, of course, because you can say all nostalgic stories are once upon a time stories, but not the other way around. Not all memory stories are not going to be nostalgic. So the idea is that there will be an agglomeration of features, of linguistic features that invite or express or invite the feeling of nostalgia. Because again, there's different layers there. So it's what expresses nostalgia or wants to invite nostalgia in others is again two different things. So there's again another overlap there. And for sure we can never tell, because we can't know the intentions of the person who expressed things in writing or speech, nor can we be sure about what that would trigger in any other person other than us. So, although psychologists themselves say people tend to recognize nostalgia when they see it, and I tend to sort to agree with the statement. It's a hunch I tend to agree with. With Charlotte, we built the Desert Island Discs corpus because the Desert Island Disc corpus has so many different layers of nostalgia that are inbuilt into it. Like Desert Island Discs itself being an institution that people look at nostalgic.
So this is a radio interview where a celebrity guest talks through their favorite songs and their memories associated with the songs.
Exactly. So it's track of their lifetimes, and it has been going on since the late 1940s, and it's still kicking. And so it gives you a diachronic perspective, but it's also there to sort of invite nostalgia in the listener. So we thought what we need is prototypically nostalgic text to see whether there are prototypically nostalgic features that we can pull out. So that's where the yes comes. So yes, we can find prototypically nostalgic features, but the linguistic expressions that will vehiculate these features are multiple, and so we can have precision up to a point, but we can't have total recall. Nor at some point we should, maybe. I mean, we have this great favor of recall over precision in corpus linguistics, but sometimes we perhaps should, tip the balance towards precision in favor of precision as opposed to recall. If that answers the question of difficulty, but there's a lot more to be said. So,
yeah, I suppose it depends on how much manual filtering out you're prepared to do in terms of what you can tolerate on that scale, really, of getting lots of stuff that might be nostalgic and finding that loads of it actually isn't in your concordance lines, for instance. So, but it is a really interesting question. Yeah, Charlotte, I'll let you come in here as well. What are your thoughts on this in terms of the challenge of looking for nostalgia in corpus data?
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways of doing it. So, I mean, the project that Anna and I were sort of working on and hoping we're going to take forward is this thing of, looking for markers of nostalgia. Yeah. So we start with these overtly nostalgic texts. And there it is really about combinations and then working on checking those combinations, and they're going to be quite genre and register specific. But I think that's really important because, I mean, I don't know about you, but I hear a lot of assertions being made about, we are an incredibly nostalgic era. The UK in particular is going through this very nostalgic period because we're in a period of decline generally. And, there's always that question of, well, are we, right? Yeah. And how do we find out if we are? And so to work on this way of finding these markers of nostalgia, I think would be really, really important for trying to sort of get some measure of nostalgizing, let's say. But the other way of doing it, of course, is looking at sort of testing assertions about the past, where you've got the assertion that's made that is potentially nostalgic, and then you can go back and look at it and see what was actually happening at that moment in time to tell whether that memory is a nostalgic memory, a rose-tinted memory. And so that's what I was doing with some of the migration projects, where I was looking at, assertions that were made about how people were treated at one point in the past, and then going back and seeing, was this true? Did we really talk about them in different ways?
It's nostalgia. You certainly convinced me of not that I needed it necessarily, but there's clearly intuitively something very appealing to humanity in terms of nostalgia, and you're right in terms of the personal experience of it. It almost feels innate, that these kind of sometimes involuntary moments of not the same as deja vu, of course, but a similar kind of this takes me right back to whenever it was. And clearly the popularity of shows like Desert Island Disc, which, as you say, that's the whole point of them, is talking about the past and memories of the past. The fact that that's been running for so long shows that there's clearly a great interest, and people are maybe naturally drawn to those kind of feelings. But from a back to the sort of political context, I'm particularly interested. You mentioned Trump earlier, and from kind of the persuasive perspective of, say, politicians giving campaign speeches, and of course in the UK we're going to be seeing an awful lot of those over the next few months, no doubt, and debates, etc., leading up to a general election. There's clearly evidence that there's an appeal to nostalgia, but what evidence is there of actually does it work? As in, if a politician, you said collective nostalgia and bringing people together, and as a strategy, there's an intention to have a certain effect in terms of getting people to vote for them or support their party or whatever. But this might be kind of really tricky. But is there evidence that it actually does work quite effectively to achieve that goal from a political perspective?
I mean, obviously it always varies a bit, but there is a substantial body of work from social psychology saying yes, in different domains it does work. So around advertising, there have been studies that show that adverts which try to prompt nostalgia typically do prompt nostalgic feelings and increase warmness towards the products that's being sold. So and in the political sphere, because it has this proven efficacy, let's say, of increasing a sense of membership of a particular community, if you can get people to feel like they share some kind of past that is kind of missing or threatened now, then yes, that does have an effect. But it's not guaranteed, because it depends, on the audience you're talking to. Can they buy into the image of the past that you're selling, essentially? So if they can buy into it, it'll work. But if they don't buy into it, then it might not. And I think the classic example of this in the UK context was from a couple of decades ago, where it was John Major, then Prime Minister, gave this very nostalgic speech about people drinking warm beer and old maids cycling down lanes. And everybody laughed at it. Nobody was buying into this, right? And it was actually doing sort of quite effective things in its own right. But it was an image of the past nobody wanted to buy into at that moment. So it is effective, but it depends whether it's a version of the past that's accessible.
Yeah. And you mentioned... go ahead, Anna.
No, at the same time, methodologically, it's difficult. So the same way that it's difficult to distinguish between different types of memory, it's also difficult to, distinguish between clearly cut emotions. So it's true that there is nostalgic discourse, but the porous boundaries between nostalgia and anger, or nostalgia and hope, or nostalgia and other feelings in the effectiveness of political discourse. I mean, I find it sometimes a bit unconvincing that we pin down the effectiveness of a specific message, such as "Make America Great Again," to nostalgia itself, because in that case, so much intertwined with anger that it's difficult to say this is because it was effective because it sort of called on to nostalgic feelings that are so warm and fuzzy and shareable.
And I think you're right that particularly you say there about nostalgia and anger. I mean, and Charlotte, you mentioned migration discourses earlier. I mean, in the UK, for instance, immigration is a huge, has been for a long time, but particularly at the moment seems to be a really dominant political topic, and will be undoubtedly one of the major kind of factors in whenever the next election does come in the next few months. And I see a lot of discussions online, especially on Twitter, which, well, I should say X now. I don't stop making that error. I'm going to start sounding out of fashion. It's X.
Nostalgic.
Indeed. I remember when it was Twitter. Oh, that was a good old day. No, but really. But the people say from particular groups who are very much against any form of immigration at sort of at the extreme end of the conversation, talking, sharing pictures from decades ago, you're saying the 50s or something, a playground full of white children playing, and sort of, remember, this is when we peaked kind of thing, and it's all gone downhill since. And then you've got other people saying, hang on a minute, so many things were terrible back then that are so much better now, in terms of other issues. Are you really wanting to go back to when, I don't know, healthcare was terrible, or education was really poor, or there was high levels of poverty, or X, Y, and Z? You're dreaming of a reality that you likely didn't actually live yourself, which goes back to what you said. You hear a lot of people sort of talking about, well, back in the war, well, you were born in 1955. What do you know about, living through the war? Whatever. Same kind of thing, which does suggest that even if it's hard to measure its effectiveness, that it's clearly an appealing tool. And I think, it makes sense in that way. As we start to go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, it goes back to the analogy you were making with metaphor, right? Is that in these kinds of political domains, nostalgia functions like metaphor as a rhetorical device, and it's partial. So it's going to foreground some aspects and background others at the same time.
Yeah. And I think it'll be interesting to see just how much nostalgia there is in the upcoming UK general election. Well, you've convinced me that I can assume there will be lots of it. So the question should be, what will they be appealing to, rather than will they be appealing to? As we start to wrap up, I mean, I'm so grateful for your time today, and I'll look back fondly on this conversation. I will start. It's even too cheesy for me to say. But I just want to sort of ask, sort of on a more practical level, about the kind of in a community, I suppose, that you're starting to create over the last year or so around your interest in nostalgia, because of course it's not just the two of you who have from Corpus Linguistics world that have become interested in this. I think you've organized workshops, and you have a kind of online collaborative bibliography of studies around nostalgia. So I wonder if you can sort of speak a little bit to the kind of broader initiatives that you've launched over the last year or so with bringing in other researchers, and the kind of reception you've had to initiating these conversations around what can corpus linguistics do with the study of nostalgia in language?
I think we tried that because of the complexity itself. So we thought this is a complex thing, and we need more voices, more ideas, more perspectives on it. And on one hand, language is not much looked at in the context of nostalgia. So we were doing something that wasn't been done yet. So we're happy about that. But we needed the expertise of people who have worked on nostalgia, on philosophy, history, and things like that. So, and to read widely, because one thing we tend perhaps to do within any discipline is to read deep into the discipline. But in my experience, especially with cats, you have to read wide as well as deep. And because it's omnivorous, you get so many ideas from different corners. But then, of course, you're not an expert of those corners. So you need help as well. So the first thing we did, we had workshop here at University of Bologna on a hilltop, very nice hilltop. We had 30 people from, I think it was like 19 different places. So very, very varied, and many different universities and colleagues were working on language and linguistics, yes, but different things from us. So, and different areas as well. And we had people working in philosophy and history, nostalgia studies. And we asked exactly the question you asked before: how on earth are we going to find nostalgic discourse? And we tried to find heuristics to do that, or to distinguish, even define nostalgia when we thought we'd found it. We all agreed this is nostalgic, for example. That's not a superficial thing to, as I said, people think that we do sort of recognize nostalgia when we see it, but is it true? So it was worth exploring. And so we gave this desert island disc corpus to all these different people, and we played with it for 3 days, and it was fantastic. And from that, the idea of the summer school emerged. So we did a summer school a few months after, where we expanded the methodological issues. So how do you go from form to function really was very much the point of the summer school. So, and we are still working on that in a collective way. But I think, yes, collectivity or community, the community you build around any topic really in research, make it worth studying it. I mean, it's the best part of our job, I think.
That's brilliant, and it's great that there's been, there's a nostalgia collective, I suppose, what you call what do you call a group of nostalgia researchers? But it's brilliant that there's a community, and I think that's actually a really, it may have seemed an obvious approach to you, but actually, if you're launching into a new topic of research, just simply getting people together and asking, for help in a way. And so how do you, how do you think we should do this? It's not necessarily something that researchers, not that I don't think they don't want to do that, but rather often they don't necessarily have the capacity to be able to do that as much as they want to. So I think it's a really good example of a practice that I certainly think we should all try and find the space to do more of. Just openly asking questions and not feeling a pressure to immediately have a plan to know how to do it straight away, but rather to think about the issue and kind of in a sandbox in a way. I think that's a really brilliant thing that you've done, and more of that sort of thing I think would be good for us all. So that's brilliant. I do realize that we're rapidly running out of time. As much as that there's a million other things that I'd love to ask. So I will, I do have these quick questions, and I did share with you in advance what they are, but I think we'll squeeze in maybe just one each. And if you like, a bit of fun, I might even let you choose which one. If there's one that speaks to you particularly, that you'd like to answer, there's the three of them there. Is there a one that either of you feel particularly strongly that you'd like to make your case because, of course, these are the same questions I ask each guest. So we sort of go back and compare which side of the fence you sit on with these debates. But Charlotte, maybe I'll start with you. You've got 1, 2, or 3. Of course, one option is to say none of them, and that's fine as well, of course. But
no, well, I'm going to say absolutely not 3. That's the one I'm going to reject.
Okay.
So I don't know. I'd probably go for the number 1 piece of advice, because I feel like this is the thing that I do a lot of.
Okay,
probably.
So this is question 2, which is, what is your number 1 piece of advice for students embarking on corpus research?
Yeah, and I think the first thing, and it's always, it goes back to, the approach we've taken to this project, is start with working out what you know or what you don't know, and then think about using the corpus tools. But it's got to be question first, corpus approach second. And so I would really say, make sure there's a reason for asking the questions that you're asking. Make sure you don't already know the answer. Make sure the answer is going to be interesting to you, or you're going to get tired of it very quickly. And make sure there's space to be wrong. Don't ask a question that's going to just prove you right when you look in the corpus.
Oh, I love that. And I don't think we've actually had that piece of advice before. So I'm especially grateful for that. That is very good. Thank you. Anna, you have 2 left to choose.
I know I was going to choose the same, but I was thinking the same answer. So that's
of course you were. That's not the book.
There aren't any rules here. You can answer the same one if you want.
No, not really. I mean, it would be a very similar answer. So since Charlotte discarded it, I go for 3.
Oh, okay. Okay, so this one is, what will corpus research look like in 50 years?
So I have a fear and a hope about it. The fear is that perhaps there will be a further split between the computational side, the big data fascination of corpus linguistics, and the more discourse side of it. And the hope instead is that there should be more interdisciplinarity, both between these 2 sides of the same discipline and other disciplines, so more collaboration. And because I think that corpus linguistics, when used by other disciplines, is very much used as a tool, whereas I don't think corpus linguistics is a tool at all. It's a way of looking at things. So it's not a set of practices. It's a way of looking at things. At the same time, the drive towards bag of words approaches makes it feel a little bit too much like a box of tools to me. And my hope is that growing importance will be credited to context. This is because we have sub-registers within registers, and we know how much they are important, things like that. In the book that Charlotte and I co-edited, Jesse Edward wrote a chapter where he talks about not missing the trees for the forest, so the importance of text, and that's key to me. But it's also key not to miss even the forest for the logs. So the logs in the lumber factory, because the forest is the context, and the corpus is alive in that. And
I share your hope, but I also share your fear, because of course as data sets get bigger and bigger and bigger, logically it gets harder and harder and harder to do just that. But it's crucial, otherwise, the whole thing falls apart, I think, potentially. So on that note, we will draw things to a close. Those who are only listening to us on audio will be wondering why on earth I'm chuckling randomly at certain points, but it'll be a bit more obvious on the video. I sort of catch myself saying something and realize, what on earth am I talking about? Anyway, that is it for this episode of CorpusCast. So thank you to our viewers and listeners for joining us on your platform of choice, whether that's YouTube or wherever it is you get your podcasts. In the meantime, do let us know your thoughts using the hashtag CorpusCast, and make sure to check out the Aston Corpus Linguistics Research Group on X at Aston Corpus, and you can follow me at Lovermob. CorpusCast is an Aston Originals podcast hosted by me, Robbie Love, and produced by Sam Cook. So thanks again to our listeners. We'll see you next time. And thanks, most importantly, to my guests today, Charlotte Taylor and Anna Marchi. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak with you both, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.